Hi friends, we are in After Effects again and we're going to look at a few tips and tricks in order to get a little bit more realistic motion and movement happening in your animation. So I've set up my composition. I have a basic shape here. The very first thing I want to show you guys is how to move your axis point around. Anchor point. We do have the option here to change it in the transform drop down. That's sometimes a little hard to use, so in order to just click and move this about, you can use your pan behind button. That is on the top toolbar and it's right here next to the camera, so pan behind anchor point tool. So you can just click on that and then select your anchor point and move that around to where you want that to be. So sometimes that's a little easier to use. I thought I would mention that first. So just going to scale down this very large shape that I have, and I'm going to add a basic position change to that. So I will start my shape on this left hand side and move that along to the right hand side a couple of seconds in. Okay, so if we play that, we can see that it is a very consistent motion, and we can see at any point in time it is staying the same shape. So the first thing I want to show you guys is the idea of motion blur, and that just adds a little bit of blur that increases the faster your shape moves, and that sort of replicates what our eyes would see if something was moving in front of us. So to add that to your layer, you want to make sure that your motion blur symbol is turned on. So at the top of the timeline here, grey is off and blue is on. And then for each layer that you want to add motion blur to, you just come along opposite its name and find the same motion blur symbol here, which is those three circles, and check that on, and that will add motion blur to this layer. So then when we play this, you can see that there's some blurring of the edges, and as I pause it somewhere in the middle, you can see that along the sides of this triangle there's a little bit of blur. So if I even shorten that animation a little bit more, you can see as it moves faster there's a lot more blur on the edges of the shape here. So motion blur will kind of add a little more realism to your animation. Alright, the second thing I want to talk about is turning these layers into 3D layers. So with Project 3 we want everyone to be working with 2D geometry, so all of these flat shapes from your symbol. But that doesn't mean that you can't work with a 3D layer and use the Z axis, so you have three axes to work upon. So it's the same principle as adding your motion blur. On the layer that you want to make into a 3D layer, you come across to these icons, and under the icon of the little box you check that on, and you can see all of the options come up beneath the transform drop down. So you have the opportunity to play with not only the X, Y position, but also the Z axis. So if I move that, you can see that that is sort of disappearing. It kind of just looks like it's shrinking at the moment, and that is coming towards the viewer along that Z axis. We can also rotate in three ways. So if you think about the Z axis going from the viewer to the very back of the screen, and you rotate around that, you can see that that's actually just keeping the object as 2D and rotating it around that invisible line. With Y, we have the horizontal axis, and that is rotating it along that horizontal axis. So you can see I can sort of flip my shape there. And then with X we have the tilting forwards. Sorry, Y was the vertical axis and X is the horizontal axis. So we have those tilting. And then if I have my tilted shape and I position that further back along the Z axis, you can kind of see that disappearing and then coming closer. So you can play with that sort of thing when you have a 3D layer on, which I thought would be kind of handy. So I'm just going to turn that off for now, And next thing is looking at easing. So we have the motion blur on, and that is looking pretty good. But we want to add a little bit more realistic motion in terms of velocity. So speeding up and slowing down when it comes to the starting and finishing points. So the way to add this sort of easing for motion is to right click on your keyframe, and you'll have the keyframe assistant pop up. Now you can go into keyframe velocity and change those values yourself, but if you just want a really quick ease, you can use any of these three options, and I almost always use Easy Ease and do that to both of my in and out keyframes, but you can play with those. So you can see when I play this, sort of takes a little while to get to its full velocity, and then slows down a little at the end. So we'll just watch that one more time. And it just makes that movement a little bit more realistic, so it's not completely constant. It takes a little bit of time to start, full velocity, and then sort of slows down towards the end. So that's easing, and that is going to make all of your motion a little bit less sort of sterile in a way, sort of computer generated. Okay, and the last thing is looking at how to use expressions in After Effects. So some of you may have found out already that you can add pieces of code to your values down here. So one of the most useful ones that I think could help you is wiggle. So I'm going to add a little bit of wiggle to my position, and the way to access expressions is to hold down Alt or Option and to click the stopwatch of the property that you want to change. So when I hold down Alt and I click that stopwatch, we get this little text area which we can add our expressions to. And if you want to Google After Effects expressions, you'll get a whole list of things that you can change. I'm just going to go through a few of them here. So what wiggle is going to do, oops, spelled that wrong. What wiggle is going to do is basically move your shape around by however much you input the value in. So it kind of gives it a little bit of a jitter, a little bit of a shake, and it just adds a little bit more life to it, I guess, instead of just being completely frozen and just sitting there waiting for the next motion. So wiggle is kind of useful in a lot of different ways. So after our transform position, I've put a comma, and then I've written wiggle, and then you use an open bracket, and the first number you put in here is how many times your shape is going to wiggle per second. So if you had 100 times a second, you can imagine that would be shaking about really fast, or just 3 times a second it will be quite smooth. So I'm going to go for 15 times per second, and you put a comma, and the second number you put in is the average amount of pixels that you want your shape to move. So if you had a very large number here, it would jump all over the page. If you had a very small number, it would just sort of move move really, like, I've forgotten the words, move almost unnoticeably. So I'm going to put in something that we can all see, about 40 pixels around, and then close your bracket, and that is your expression. So now when I play this, you can see that my triangle wiggles all about. And so the amount that it's moving around here is 40 pixels-ish. It's going to take a random sort of number. And it's moving 15 times per second. So if I change that number down to 3, and now we play it, you can see that it still moves the same height. It sort of moves around the same, but it's much slower, so it's only moving 3 times per second. So wiggle is kind of useful. We can change that to maybe 10 and bump this up to say 300 times a second, It's going to be very fast, but it's going to be very small. So you can see that moving up and down really fast all over the place. So this could be good if you're looking at some sort of symbol that conveys an anxiety, or it's building up to some sort of huge explosion. You could add a little bit of wiggle to show that there's some nervousness or some some motion there. So that's wiggle. I'm just going to take that off of the position, and we will now look at a few of the longer coded expressions. So I'm going to add the link to this website underneath the tutorial down on YouTube, so just click into the description to find this. And this is a page that has some pre-written codes for you, so you can add them in to your values. There is jumpy wiggle, so that kind of moves at random. Jumpy wiggle 2, so these are kind of getting a little more complicated than just the wiggle that I've shown you. And things moving constantly. But here we have inertial bounce, and this is kind of nice to replicate that sort of bouncy ball effect, where when you drop something it doesn't just fall and stop, it actually falls and then bounces a little bit before it stops. So I'm just going to copy the code from here and back into After Effects. Same in my position, I'm going to alt click on the stopwatch, I'm going to put a comma in, and then I'm just going to paste that code in there. So if I pull that down, you can see I have all my code in that expression box. Alright, so then when I play this, you can see that I move along, and that didn't work. Why didn't that work? Transform position. Is it because I have easy ease on? Could be because I have ease on. Let's just take that off. Such a good tutorial. Okay. There we go. It's because I had ease on. So you can see towards the end there, my triangle doesn't just sit, it kind of springs back and forth before it settles. And if I actually make that movement a little bit faster, you can see that that's sort of springing back into place as if it was sort of stuck there by an elastic band. So the inertial bounce is going to give you a little bit of motion, and of course if you change your starting position you can sort of make this sort of a dropping motion as well. So you can change that, you can add that to any sort of position, and it will just sit there. If you wanted to change how this looks at all, I'd suggest playing with the amplification, frequency and decay. If you wanted it to sort of not bounce as much, your decay would be higher, because the drop-off rate would be higher, which means that it wouldn't bounce as much. So here you can see that that just sort of sits a little heavier. So these values are what I would change to kind of get the look that you're after. So yeah, have a look at these sort of things on that page. And the very last thing I wanted to look at is time. So if we just take this off, so sometimes you are adding an effect and you want that to just sort of keep happening, and you don't want to have to keyframe all of that continuously throughout your animation. With rotation, I'll show you this, it works for obviously anything. I'm going to start 1 second, and then 1 second later I'm going to have a full rotation. So I'll just add 1 to my times. So we can see that the triangle does 1 full rotation. Now if I wanted to keep that rotating, and I didn't want to say keyframe this further on, what I would do is I would add an expression to my rotation. So again, alt click on the stopwatch, and you can simply add time, which is the time of your entire animation, and add in the little times button, which is Shift 8 on my keyboard. And then you'd kind of add in, what is it? Basically, the higher the number, the more times this is going to repeat itself. So it's the amount of repetition, I guess. So over the entire time of my animation, I want this to repeat maybe 100 times. And then you can see that even though I only have those 2 keyframes, my animation is going to continue to rotate over and over again across my entire animation. So this is a pretty handy way of sort of repeating your motion or just getting something to turn constantly. And same for changing the scale and things like that. So along with time, there are lots of things you can do to sort of mimic this repetition. There's something called loop out, which is really, really interesting. So here on the rotation, if I add a loop out, so we're using camel case, so it's loop and then capital O-U-T. In my brackets, I would put cycle in quotation marks, and then my second number is essentially going to be, what are we looking at? Sorry, it's really late. I'm recording this at like 2 AM. I don't know why. I'm looking at, no, default value of 0. So we have cycle in our brackets, and I think that will do. So if I play that, you can see that that continues to loop at the same rate as it was looping before. So we have whatever's happening between 1 and 2 just gets repeated after 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6. So loop out and cycle is really great, but you can also change cycle to the word ping pong. And what ping pong will do is kind of play it forwards, play it backwards, play it forwards, play it backwards. So you get this really interesting effect of playing forwards and then reversing, and then playing forwards and then reversing. So this is kind of nice. It'll give you that like windscreen wiper effect. So you can play with the loop out a little bit. But again, expressions, there's so many that you can use. Just maybe go online and have a search around for yourself, find some tutorials to see what you can do with them, and that should help you add a little bit more realism and polish to your animation.